Wyoming Territory, 1887. The train did not just stop at Ash Mesa, it seemed to surrender, hissing steam into a wind that already owned everything. The air was the color of old pewter, and the cold had teeth. It bit through the wool of Rowan Hale's coat, through the thin fabric of her gloves, and settled deep in the marrow of her bones. She stood alone on the splintered platform, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent gray. The other passengers, 3 miners and a whiskey salesman, had vanished into the cluster of false front buildings that constituted the town, leaving only the smell of coal smoke and damp iron. Rowan's hands were clamped onto the handle of a heavy pine box, its corners reinforced with brass. Inside, protected by velvet lining and desperate hope, rested her livelihood, a wet plate collodion camera, glass negatives, and the volatile chemicals required to capture the truth. A smaller valise at her feet held the last of her worldly possessions. She had come west chasing a lie written in precise, confident brown ink. The letter, now tucked against her breast, was a fantasy of proposal. It spoke of a wealthy rancher, a man named Silas Croft, who sought a companion of refined character and modern sensibilities. He had, the letter claimed, seen a portrait she had taken in Cheyenne and admired her artistry. He owned, he wrote, 1,000 head of cattle and a house with glass windows. Rowan Hale was a widow, and she was a photographer. The world was rarely kind to either, and she was tired of fighting for scraps of respect in crowded eastern cities. The letter had promised not just a husband, but space, a new sky, a place where her images might matter. But the station platform was empty. There was no Silas Croft. There was no welcoming party, no carriage. There was only the high, thin shriek of the wind coming off the high plains, a sound that seemed to pull the warmth from her very name. She had known, in that first cold second the train pulled away, that she had been fooled. The letter was a fabrication, a cruel joke played on a woman desperate enough to believe in a new beginning. From the shadow of the water tower, 2 railroad men in canvas coats watched her. They were chewing tobacco, the dark spittle freezing almost instantly as it hit the iced ground. "That's her," one said, his voice loud enough to carry, "the picture taker, from back east." The other laughed, a short, barking sound. "Looks like her rich rancher forgot the welcome wagon, or maybe he sobered up." "She's a widow, Jed," the first man said, nudging his companion. "Come to trap a new one. Heard she was aiming for Silas Croft, but Croft ain't been seen in 3 months. "More likely," Jed replied. "She's just another stray. She'll be working at the Silver Latch Saloon by Saturday, and not taking pictures." Rowan's spine stiffened. She could feel the hot sting of tears, an acidic burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. To cry here, in front of these men, would be to dissolve completely. She was 32 years old. She had buried a husband taken by consumption. She had learned the difficult, messy art of collodion, her hands stained black with silver nitrate. She would not be undone by 2 grimy men on a desolate platform. She lifted her chin, her gaze fixed on the snow-dusted peak that gave the town its name, and let the cold freeze the moisture in her eyes. The men's laughter subsided, turning to bored muttering as she offered them nothing. The silence that fell was heavy, broken only by the wind and the nervous stamping of the station master's horse, tied to a hitching post. Then, a new sound threaded through the air. It was sharp, rhythmic, distinct, the crack of iron horseshoes on ice-slicked rock. It came from the north, a single rider, moving without haste. The horse, a powerful bay breathing clouds of steam, was ridden by a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself. He wore an old greatcoat, the color of winter dusk, its collar turned up to meet the brim of a stained hat. He pulled the horse to a halt, not in front of Rowan, but parallel to her, his gaze sweeping over the station, the town, and finally, her. His eyes were the most startling thing. They were a pale, washed-out blue, recessed in a face weathered by sun and isolation. They were the eyes of a man who had lived too long alone, tired eyes that had seen too many winters and expected nothing from the next. He didn't move for a long moment, simply assessing her the fine, cold, pinched features, the impractical city coat, and the heavy, professional-looking box at her side. He was Gideon Vance, owner of the Blue Badger Ranch up in the Painted Basin, though Rowan could not know that. He was a man of few words, most of them clipped. His horse shifted, and the man's gaze finally met hers. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, as if pulled up from a dry well. "You got shelter for the night." Rowan's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not the welcome she had imagined, but it was the first human voice that hadn't been weaponized against her. Still, the sting of the lie was too fresh. She was a target. "I don't go with men," she said, her own voice tight and thin. The man's expression did not change. He didn't smile, nor did he scowl. He merely absorbed her words as one might absorb a fleck of snow. "I'm not asking anyone to stay," Gideon Vance replied. He nodded, once, toward the sky, where the pewter gray was darkening, and the wind had begun to carry the first stinging needles of sleet. "That storm ain't waiting. Town's full up with miners," as if summoned by his words. A vicious gust tore across the platform. It ripped the hat from Rowan's head, sending it tumbling across the icy planks. Instinctively, she lunged for it, her hand slipping from the camera box. The heavy pine case, her entire future, tilted dangerously. Before she could react, the man was off his horse. He moved with a surprising, fluid economy, not for the hat, but for the box. His gloved hand closed over the brass handle. He did not touch her. He didn't grab her arm or steady her shoulder. He simply took the weight of the box, anchoring it and, by extension, her against the force of the wind. He was a solid mass of wet wool and cold leather. He held the box steady while she scrambled to retrieve her hat, jamming it back onto her head and securing it with a pin. Her fingers numb and clumsy. She straightened, breathing hard, the sleet now plastering strands of dark hair to her cheeks. He looked at the box, then at her. "This is your trade." "Yes," she said, defiant. He nodded again, a slow acknowledgement of the weight. He made no move to release it. He had seen her choice the hat or the camera. He understood the burden. Rowan made a calculation. Pride was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. The wind, which had stolen her hat, now seemed to be clawing at her coat, seeking her bones. "I will accept a ride," she said, the words stiff. "On one condition, I leave as soon as it is light." Gideon Vance finally released his grip on the box, though he kept his hand near it. "There's fire at Bearflower Lodge." It was the only acceptance she would get. He loaded the heavy box first, securing it with practiced hands to the back of his saddle, treating it with a strange, unspoken respect. Then he mounted the bay, the horse grunting at the combined weight. He looked down at her, offering a single, leather-clad hand. Rowan hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was hard, impersonal, and strong. He pulled her up behind the saddle with an ease that spoke of immense physical strength, and she settled herself, her hands gripping the cold rim of the saddle cantle, her valise clutched in her lap. She was careful not to touch him, though the biting cold made her wish for any source of warmth. He wheeled the horse, turning away from the dim lights of Ash Mesa, and urged the bay into a steady walk toward the high, dark ridges. The ride to the ranch was over Crowfoot Ridge. The world dissolved into a spectrum of cold blues and deep, bruised violets. The sleet turned to snow, thick flakes that muffled the world, isolating them in a moving cocoon of silence. The only sounds were the creak of the saddle leather, the rhythmic thud and crunch of the horse's hooves breaking the frozen crust, and the rasp of their own breathing. Far off, in the deepening gloom, a gathering of crows took flight from a stand of skeletal pines. Their cawing was raw and loud in the sudden stillness, a chorus of dark voices shouting across the frozen basin, like reminders of all the secrets that had not yet been buried. The horse stopped, its head drooping, the steam from its body rising like a prayer into the blackening sky. Bearflower Lodge was not a house. It was a shelter, hunkered low against the rising slope of the basin, built of thick pine logs chinked with mud and purpose. It seemed to have grown from the stony ground rather than been built upon it. A plume of smoke was already rising from the chimney, a thin gray line against the heavy, oppressive clouds. Gideon Vance swung down from the saddle. He moved with the slow, deliberate stiffness of a man whose joints ached with the cold. He did not help Rowan down. He went first to the back of the saddle and, with care, unstrapped the heavy pine box. He carried it to the cabin's narrow porch and set it down under the meager overhang before turning back for her valise. Only then, his hands empty, did he look up at her. Rowan slid down herself, her legs numb and clumsy. She nearly fell as her boots hit the treacherous, icy ground. But she caught herself on the saddle leather, her pride stinging more than her frozen cheeks. He pushed the heavy plank door open. A wave of warmth rolled out. Not hot, but a blessed absence of the wind's bite. It smelled of dry wood, old smoke, leather, and something metallic, like cured meat. The lodge was a single room. The fire in the cast-iron stove in the far corner provided the only light, a pulsating orange glow that threw massive, dancing shadows. Against the immediate cold, Gideon moved to the stove, his back to her, and used a poker to settle the logs. The fire flared, and the room was illuminated. Rowan Hale, a woman who lived by observation, took it all in. The space was meticulously, almost painfully, neat. To her left, a narrow ladder led up to a sleeping loft, barely large enough for a single cot. To her right, a dry sink with a tin basin. The water bucket beside it filmed with ice. A rough-hewn table, scrubbed nearly white, stood in the center with two straight-backed chairs. And in front of the stove, dominating the floor, was a bear rug. It was old, the fur thick but worn in patches, the claws intact, the great head, its glass eyes catching the firelight, seemed to stare past them, a silent, perpetual witness to the isolation of this place. It was the only item in the cabin that spoke of anything other than pure function. Rowan looked for the small signs of domesticity. She knew a quilt, a jar of flowers, a spare bonnet on a hook. There was nothing. The tin plates on the shelf were stacked in a perfect column. The floor was swept clean of all but the snow she and Gideon had just tracked in. This was not a home. It was a holding cell against the winter. She could feel the crushing weight of his solitude. He had been alone for a very long time. Gideon did not look at her. He took a snow-caked log from the wood box and fed it to the stove, closing the iron door with a solid thud. "Soup's on the stove," he said to the fire. "It's beans." He moved to the table, taking 2 tin bowls from the shelf. Rowan remained by the door, dripping onto the floorboards, feeling large and intrusive in the small space. They were separated by perhaps 12 feet of floor, but they had to move around each other's presence. "You should take off your coat," he said, still not turning. "It'll freeze solid on you." She unwound her scarf, her fingers fumbling with the pin of her hat. She unbuttoned the heavy wool coat, her movements stiff. She looked for a place to hang it. Gideon noticed her hesitation, gestured with his head to a row of wooden pegs by the door. She hung her coat and hat. Underneath, her dark traveling dress, though practical, felt flimsy and inadequate. He ladled the soup. It was thick with navy beans and flecks of salt pork, steaming in the cold air. He placed one bowl on the table, then the other. He set down 2 spoons. He sat in the chair facing the stove. Rowan, accepting the silent invitation, took the other, her back to the door. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the click, scrape of their metal spoons against the tin bowls. The sound was abrasive, intimate, highlighting every empty space between them. They were 2 strangers, sharing the most basic ritual of warmth and food, and the act felt profoundly unnatural. The soup was hot, scalped her tongue, but she was grateful for the simple, uncomplicated burn. Gideon finished first. He pushed his bowl away and leaned back in the chair, his hands resting on his thighs. He finally looked at her, his gaze level and assessing. "I didn't write any marriage letter," he said. His directness was like a slap. Rowan set her spoon down carefully beside her bowl. "I know," she replied. He visibly stiffened. This was not the answer he had expected. He had braced for tears, for accusations, for the pleading of a duped woman. "I deduced it was a hoax before I left Cheyenne." Rowan continued, her voice quiet but firm. "The station master there confirmed it. The name Silas Croft is an invention. The land described doesn't exist. The letter was a lie to lure me here." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you come?" "I had already paid for the ticket. The money was spent." She met his gaze, refusing to be seen as a fool. "And I'm tired of the East. I'm a photographer. Mr. Vance. I came to capture this land. I'm not looking for a rescue." She paused, letting the implication settle. "I only require a roof until the storm passes. I said I would leave at dawn." As if summoned, the storm struck the cabin with a physical, violent force. It was no longer a wind. It was a solid wall of ice and noise. The entire cabin shuddered. The two small windows rattled in their frames with a sound like chattering teeth. A cold draft snaked under the door, swirling the dust on the floor. Gideon rose from his chair and went to the nearest window, wiping the condensation from the glass. He peered out into the churning, absolute white. "Dawn won't make a difference," he said, his voice flat. "We're closed in. Crowfoot Ridge will be impassable for 2, maybe 3 days. Rowan's stomach tightened. Trapped. The word echoed from the platform. She was trapped again, this time in a single room with a man she did not know. A man who lived with a bear rug and old ghosts. She stood, needing to move. The cabin felt suddenly impossibly small. She walked the few paces to the fireplace, her hands clasped in front of her, then turned. Her gaze fell on a tall, narrow pine cabinet standing against the back wall, near his cot. Unlike the rest of the rough-hewn furniture, this piece was well made, with a heavy brass lock. Tucked beneath it, as if kicked there by accident, was the corner of a paper. Rowan bent slightly. She was a woman of details. She saw the precise, ruled lines of a map, surveying marks, and on another paper, partially visible, was a printed letterhead Granite Plains Railroad. Beside it, a receipt ledger. "My business." The voice came from directly behind her. It was low and sharp, devoid of its earlier hoarseness. Rowan straightened instantly, heat rising in her neck. He was standing just a foot away, his proximity a physical warning. He hadn't moved to block her. He simply stood, his presence filling the space. He leaned down, retrieved the papers, and tucked them firmly back inside the cabinet. He did not lock it, but the message was clear. The tension in the room was now a tangible thing, as thick and cold as the air outside. Gideon broke it. He turned away from her, walking to the corner sleeping area. There was a narrow cot built into the wall, and above it, the loft she had seen. He pulled a heavy, clean-smelling wool blanket from a wooden chest at the foot of the cot. He gestured with his chin toward the ladder. "You take the loft." Rowan looked from the loft to him. "And you?" He nodded at the straight-backed chair he had just vacated, the one by the stove. "I've slept in worse. I'll keep the fire." He did not say he would keep watch. She climbed the short, sturdy ladder. The loft was small, tucked under the eaves. A thin straw-stuffed mattress lay on the planks. It was cold up here, away from the stove, but the roof was low, and it felt protected. She sat, her back against the rough log wall, and pulled the blanket he had given her over her legs. From her vantage point, she could see the entire room. She watched him. Gideon did not sit. He checked the chinking around the door, then the windows. He retrieved his old, long-barreled rifle from where it rested by the door. It was a heavy, obsolete cap and ball model, but she noted, with a photographer's eye for chemical detail, that the metal was clean, the wood oiled. He did not lean it against the wall. He brought it to the chair and leaned it against the seat. Within easy reach, he finally sat down, his posture rigid, facing the fire, his profile a mask of worn granite in the flickering light. The night deepened. The storm screamed, a high, thin wail that sounded almost human, But inside, the world shrank to the sounds of the single room, the hiss and crackle of the pitch pine in the stove, the creak of Gideon's chair as he shifted his weight, and breathing. She could hear a slow, measured rhythm. He, in the absolute quiet of his world, could certainly hear hers, lighter, faster, the breathing of a cornered animal trying to feign sleep. They were suspended in the storm, separated by 10 feet of air. It was an intimacy of circumstance, not of choice. It was just enough proximity to keep the raw, elemental loneliness of the high plains at bay, but not nearly enough to trust. Rowan pulled the blanket to her chin. She spoke, her voice so low it was almost lost in the wind, not sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "I came here to photograph what is true," she whispered into the darkness. "The land, the people as they are, not as they pretend to be." For a long time, the only answer was the fire. She thought he was asleep, or ignoring her. Then, his voice rose from the chair, rough as burlap, carrying the weight of the years he had spent in this room. "Truth's the first thing that gets bought, ma'am," he said to the flames, "or buried." Rowan woke to a sound she did not recognize. It was not the wind. The wind was a constant scream, a solid thing pressing against the lodge. But this was new. It was a sharp, tearing, agonized groan, like a great beast dying. She sat up in the loft, the wool blanket clutched to her chest. The small room below was lit by the gray, frantic light of the storm. Gideon was gone. The straight-backed chair was empty, the front door ajar. Slamming rhythmically against the log frame, then the sound came again, closer. Crack! It was the barn. She was down the ladder in an instant, her stockinged feet hitting the cold floor. She pulled on her boots, not bothering to lace them, grabbed her coat, and ran out into the blizzard. The world was a chaos of white. The air was so thick with snow she could barely see 20 feet, but she followed the deep tracks Gideon had already plowed toward the low-roofed barn. The wind hit her like a solid blow, stealing her breath. She found him on the leeward side of the structure. A huge section of the sod roof, heavy with ice and snow, had collapsed inward, splintering one of the main support trusses. The remaining half of the roof was lifting and slamming down in the wind, threatening to tear the entire building apart. Gideon was already on the roof, fighting it. He was trying to brace the broken truss with a length of new pine, hammering furiously against the howl of the storm. "Stay back," he roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. He saw her, and his face, already grim, darkened with anger. This was his fight, his burden. But Rowan saw the box of cut nails at his feet slide precariously toward the edge. She saw the hammer in his hand, and she saw that he had no way to hold the truss, hold the nails, and drive them home. She didn't ask. She grabbed the edge of the roof, found purchase in the chinking, and hauled herself up. Her heavy, wet skirts wrapped around her legs, but she ignored them. The wind tried to peel her from the slick logs, but she flattened herself and crawled toward him. She reached the peak, her hair torn from its pins, whipping across her face. She grabbed the heavy box of nails just before it slid off. Gideon stopped hammering. He just stared at her. His eyes, rimmed with ice, were wide with disbelief. She was a ghost, a city woman, and she was on his roof in the middle of a blizzard. "Nails!" she shouted over the shriek of the wind. He didn't argue. He braced the new pine against the splintered truss with his shoulder. "Hold it!" Rowan shoved the nail box into a secure crevice. She took a nail, its iron head so cold it burned her glove, and held it steady for him. He struck it. The sound was a dull thud against the storm. He struck again. Thud. She fed him the nails, one after another. Her hands grew numb, the simple act of pulling a single nail from the box becoming a challenge. She held the truss steady with her other hand, her small weight added to his, fighting the wind that tried to rip the wood from their grasp. They worked in a desperate, silent rhythm. Hold, strike, hold, strike. He paused, breathing hard, to wipe the ice from his eyes. He looked at her, soaked and shivering, her face raw, her eyes fixed on the task. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was not gratitude. It was acknowledgement. She was not a package to be sheltered. She was present. They finished. The roof was secured. A jagged, ugly patch. But it would hold. Then they heard it. Below the wind, a high-pitched, terrified screaming. It was the horse. They slid down the roof, landing hard in the deep drift below. Gideon ran for the barn door, pulling it open. Inside, it was chaos. The wind howled through the new gap in the roof. Snow swirled around the single remaining stall. Gideon's bay, iron dusk, was mad with terror. The horse, a huge, muscled animal, was rearing, its eyes white, its hooves striking the wooden stall. The sound of the collapsing roof had broken him. The rope halter had already snapped, and he was seconds from destroying the stall and himself. Gideon moved to the wall, grabbing his rifle. His face was a mask of terrible, cold calculation. The horse was a danger. A broken leg in this weather was a death sentence. "No!" Rowan shouted. "Don't!" He ignored her, raising the rifle. Rowan ran forward, directly into the stall, between Gideon and the horse. "Get out!" Gideon bellowed. "He'll kill you!" "Put the gun down!" she yelled back at him, never taking her eyes from the horse. Iron Dusk reared again, his hooves missing her head by inches. She didn't flinch. "He's blind with fear," she said, her voice dropping, becoming low and steady. She was speaking to Gideon, but her tone was for the animal. "He just needs the world to stop." She fumbled in the deep pocket of her coat. Her fingers closed on what she was looking for, a heavy, black focusing cloth from her camera kit. "Easy, now," she murmured, her voice a low vibration. "Easy, I see you, I see you." She moved slowly, her hand outstretched, not with the cloth, but open. The horse snorted, a blast of hot, terrified air, and shied, crashing against the back wall. "I'm not the wind," she whispered. "I'm not the sky falling. I'm just here." She was close now. The horse was trembling, its muscles knotted, with a movement that was both swift and infinitely gentle. She brought the black cloth up and, in a single, fluid motion, draped it over the horse's eyes. The great animal went rigid. The screaming stopped, replaced by deep, shuddering breaths, deprived of the terrifying, swirling visual chaos. The horse froze. "See," Rowan whispered, placing a steady hand on the horse's neck. "It's just dark. It's just quiet. The world has stopped." She stood there, murmuring to the horse, her hand stroking the quivering neck, until the trembling eased. Behind her, she heard the metallic sound of Gideon slowly, carefully, uncocking the rifle and leaning it against the wall. He stepped forward, bringing a new rope. He worked around her, securing the halter, his large, rough hands moving with an expertise that matched her own. When the horse was secure, Rowan slowly, carefully, pulled the black cloth away. Iron Dusk tossed his head once, but he was tethered, and the calm in the stall had returned. He just watched her, his eye dark and deep. Rowan turned, her knees suddenly weak. She leaned against the stall door for support, her sodden dress clinging to her. Gideon Vance was looking at her. The exhaustion and anger were gone from his face. In their place was something she could not read, something lost. And then, the corners of his mouth, cracked from the cold, lifted. It was not a grin. It was the faint, rusty movement of a smile, a thing unused. It vanished as quickly as it came. "You're a long way from the east, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. They went back to the lodge. The small room felt like a palace. Rowan was shaking so badly she could barely unbutton her coat. Gideon built the fire high, the stove roaring, turning the iron cherry red. He gestured to her wet things. "Get dry, or you'll be dead by nightfall." He turned his back, a deliberate, formal gesture of privacy, and stared out the small window. Rowan stripped off her wet outer layers, huddling by the stove in her chemise and petticoats, wrapping the dry wool blanket from the loft around her. She saw the torn harness from the horse's stall, which Gideon had tossed on the floor. The leather strap was broken. She retrieved her valise, pulled out a small, leather-bound kit. From it, she took a heavy-gauge saddler's needle and a spool of waxed thread. She sat on the bare rug, as close to the fire as she could get, and began to stitch the heavy leather. Her hands, stained with silver nitrate from her photography, were deft and strong. The pull-push of the needle was a familiar, comforting rhythm. Gideon turned. He watched her for a long moment, this small, refined woman who had climbed his roof, tamed his horse, and now sat on his floor mending his tack. He moved to the stove, took the kettle, and scooped black tea leaves into a tin pot. He poured the boiling water, his movements clumsy, awkward. He was a man relearning the forgotten rituals of company. He poured a cup, pushed it toward her on the floor. He did not use sugar or milk. It was black, bitter, and scalding hot. Rowan took it, her fingers wrapping around the hot tin. "Thank you." He just grunted, taking his own cup to the chair. They drank in silence. The storm, their only conversation. The light in the cabin was flat and gray, but the world outside was a canvas of moving textures. Rowan, warmed by the tea, felt the pull. She stood and retrieved her heavy pine box, bringing it inside. Gideon watched, suspicious, as she began the ritual. She opened the box, the smell of collodion, ether, and alcohol filling the small space. She prepared a glass plate, her movements precise, almost reverent. "What are you doing?" he asked. "My work," she said. She looked out the window. He had gone back outside, drawn by the pull of his chores, to check the patch on the roof. He was standing with his back to her, bent slightly against the driving sleet, a dark, solitary figure against the swirling gray-white of the storm. The weak, diffused light of the blizzard seemed to gather on his shoulders, a single, warm-toned highlight against the cold. It was the truth she had come to find. It was a portrait of isolation, of resilience. She set up the camera on its tripod, aiming it through the warped, imperfect glass of the window. She uncapped the lens, counted the seconds in her head, 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, and then replaced the cap. By the time he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, she was already in the small, dark corner she had designated as her dark room, the plate in the silver bath. The knock came at midday. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of a pistol butt hammering on the wood. Gideon, who had been oiling the rifle, was on his feet instantly. He moved to the door, motioning Rowan to the side. Out of the line of sight, he opened it. 2 men stood on the porch, caked in snow. The first was large, imposing, with a thick beard frosted with ice. He wore an expensive buffalo coat and a look of cold authority. The second man was younger, leaner, with a tin deputy's badge pinned to his coat. "Vance," the first man said. He didn't ask to come in. He stepped past Gideon, bringing the cold with him. The deputy, Boyd Ledger, followed, his eyes nervously scanning the room, lingering on Rowan. "Pike," Gideon said. His voice was flat, dead. Morrow Pike, foreman for the Granite Plains Railroad, ignored Gideon and looked at Rowan. "Storm brings in all kinds," he said, his eyes insolent. "Didn't take you for a man who needed company. Vance." "She's a passenger," Gideon said. "Stranded. State your business." "My business," Pike said, "is this." He pulled a folded packet of papers from his coat, slick with melted snow. He tossed it onto the table. "Foreclosure notice. You're delinquent. Vance. That note you signed 3 years back, the railroad bought it." He smiled, a humorless stretching of his lips. "And we are calling it due. We'll take the land. Specifically, Cinder Creek. The survey crews start next week." Gideon didn't look at the paper. "The note's not due for another 6 months. And Cinder Creek is the only water on this land. You take the creek, you take the ranch. Read the paper." Pike said, "There was an accelerant clause. That old debt, it's a fickle thing." He leaned closer. "Just like that fire at the Blackwood Bridge was a fickle thing. 3 years ago, wasn't it an accident that cost the GP a fortune? You were seen in that area. Vance, Be a shame if Deputy Ledger here had to reopen that investigation. Deputy Ledger flushed, looking at his boots. Gideon stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. He was trapped. Rowan, silent in the corner, watched Pike. He was arrogant, confident, a man used to winning. He tapped the paper on the table. Your signature is on the note. Vance, the law is the law. Pike's signature was on the foreclosure notice. A bold, arrogant script. Morrow Pike. Rowan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. It was the handwriting. The tall, decisive loop of the M. The sharp, rightward slant of the P. It was unmistakable. It was the same hand that had written her letter. The same hand that had signed the name Silas Croft. Pike had lured her here. But why to be a witness, a pawn? Or was it just casual, cruel sport? Pike laughed, pulling his gloves back on. You've got till the thaw. Vance, then we take the creek. He and Ledger left, slamming the door, leaving the silence in the cabin heavy and toxic. Gideon stood staring at the paper on the table as if it were a snake. He looked broken, the strength from the morning's work gone, replaced by the old, tired hollowness. Rowan stepped out of the shadow. She picked up the foreclosure notice. Ignoring Gideon's sharp intake of breath, she studied the signature. Then she walked to her valise and retrieved the letter, the lie that had brought her here. She laid them side by side on the table. He wrote both. She said it wasn't a question. Gideon looked at the two papers, his face uncomprehending. I can prove that signature is a forgery, Rowan said, her voice clear and cold. Not the one on the notice, the one on your debt, the one that traps you. A man who forges one name will forge another. I can photograph them, enlarge them, show the identical pen strokes. I can prove he is a liar. Gideon looked at her, his eyes dark with suspicion and a deep, weary pain. This ain't your fight, ma'am, he said, his voice rough. You don't owe me anything. You said you'd leave at dawn. The storm will pass. You should go. Rowan folded her letter and put it back in her pocket. She looked at the man who had shared his fire, and then at the paper that meant to destroy him. You're right, she said, meeting his gaze. I don't owe you. She tapped the foreclosure notice signed by Pike, the man who had tried to make a fool of her, who had used her as a piece in his game. But I owe the truth. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. It did not end, but rather paused, drawing a long, ragged breath. The wind died, leaving behind a silence that felt vast and heavy. The world was a blinding, seamless white, the sky indistinguishable from the ground. Gideon had spent the 2 days in a state of suspended animation, watching her. He watched her mend his tack, watched her clean her glass plates, watched her meticulously organize the bottles of chemicals in her pine box. She moved with a quiet, contained purpose that was alien to him. She had declared war on his behalf, and then she had simply gone about her work. The truce, born of shared labor on the roof, had deepened into a wary, unspoken alliance. The ridge is open, he said, his voice flat, standing at the door. If you still want to go to town, we go, Rowan said. She was already packing her focusing cloth. He saddled Iron Dusk, the horse now docile and calm around her, and a smaller dun mare for her. The ride to Ash Mesa was a brutal, glittering trek. They moved through a landscape reborn, all its flaws buried under 6 feet of snow. The sound of the hooves was a dull, muffled thump. Gideon rode in front, his rifle in its scabbard, but his body was no longer turned away from her. He was leading her, not just allowing her to follow. Ash Mesa was half buried, its inhabitants digging out with a grim, communal energy. Smoke poured from every chimney. Rowan's arrival with Vance caused a stir. Men stopped shoveling to watch them. A silent, hard-bitten rancher and a woman in a city coat, riding as if they belonged to the same world. Where? Gideon asked, his gaze sweeping the street. I need a dark room, Rowan said, or a place I can make one. She found it at the end of the street, a small, abandoned photographer's studio. The sign, hanging by one hinge, read T.H. O'Sullivan, Portraits Landscapes. Inside, it smelled of thick dust, nesting mice, and the faint, acidic ghost of spilled chemicals. It was perfect. Gideon stood by the door while she worked, his presence a silent warning to any curious townsfolk. He did not understand what she was doing, but he understood the fierce, methodical concentration. This was her church. In the weak gray light, she set up her tripod. She pinned the foreclosure notice to the wall. She pinned her own false marriage proposal beside it. She placed the small, crumpled letter from Mercy Lowell's mother, which she had retrieved that morning, beside the other two. 3 documents, 3 lies, all written by the same confident, arrogant hand. She coated her plates, the smell of ether and collodion sharp in the cold room. She made her exposures, capturing each signature. Then, she blacked out the single window with her focusing cloth, lit a small red lantern, and began the alchemy. She developed the negatives, her hands, stained black, moving with practiced grace in the ruby light. The images swam up from the glass pike's name, Croft's name, and the anonymous script from Mercy's letter. Then came the real work. She set up her camera again, this time pointing it at a blank wall. She placed the negative of Pike's signature in the holder and made an exposure onto a fresh plate. She capped the lens. Without moving the camera, she carefully removed the first negative and replaced it with the negative of the Silas Croft signature, aligning it perfectly in the frame. She uncapped the lens again, exposing the same plate for a second time, a double exposure. She took the plate to the bath. As the image resolved, a gasp escaped her. It was not just similar, it was identical. The 2 signatures were now one, Morrow Pike and Silas Croft superimposed, the flourishes of the P and the S and M overlapping with a precision that was mechanically impossible for 2 different documents. He had not just written them in the same hand, he had traced them. He had used a template, a lazy, arrogant shortcut that had just become his undoing. She had him. She left the plates drying and walked out into the sharp air, her heart hammering. Gideon saw the look on her face and pushed himself off the wall. "The telegraph office," she said. The office was a small closet attached to the general store. It was run by Mrs. Tansy Quill, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She sat behind her clicking key, the sound filling the small space like a mechanical heartbeat. "Ma'am, Mrs. Quill said, her fingers never stopping. "Mrs. Quill, I am Rowan Hale, a photographer." Rowan placed her own small, professional card on the desk. It was a gesture of respect. One artisan to another. "I am investigating a matter for Mr. Vance, and for myself." The clicking stopped. Mrs. Quill looked at Gideon, standing in the doorway like a thundercloud. Then back at Rowan. "Go on." "I received a letter, a proposal. It was sent from Cheyenne, but I believe the message originated here. On October 17th, late in the afternoon, it was addressed to a post box in Illinois, to be forwarded to me. The sender's name was Silas Croft." Mrs. Quill's eyes sharpened. She pursed her lips, then reached for a heavy, leather-bound logbook. Her finger, stained with ink, ran down a page. She tapped it. "I remember that one. Irregular." "How so?" Rowan asked. "Wasn't wired by the sender. It was hand-delivered, a runner from Judge Cutter's office." Mrs. Quill tapped the page again. "See per instructions. J. E. Cutter. Interim." He paid for it in cash, $10, had me wire it to Cheyenne, specified the routing from there. Thought it was odd. A judge playing matchmaker for a man nobody's ever heard of. The blood drained from Rowan's face. Judge Ephraim Cutter, the man Pike had mentioned, the man who held the county fund. "Mrs. Quill," Rowan said, her voice low, "you may be called upon to testify to that logbook." Mrs. Quill looked at Gideon, at the quiet desperation that clung to him, and then at Rowan, at the cold fire in her eyes. "My log is accurate, and my memory is long. Judge Cutter has been running this county like his personal bank for too long. If you've got a weapon, young woman, you'd best know how to use it." As they left the office, A voice called to them. Soft but clear. Ma'am, Mrs. Hale. A woman stepped out from the alley between the store and the saloon. She was a black woman, her features composed and dignified, her hands clutching a small parcel wrapped in cloth. It was Mercy Lowell. I saw you go in, Mercy said, her eyes on Gideon. Then quickly back to Rowan. I heard what happened to my mother is happening to others. That letter you looked at, it wasn't just my mother. She unwrapped the parcel. Inside were 3 more letters. I've been asking, she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. I'm a seamstress. I go to folks' homes. I listen. Old man Hemlock lost his pasture last year. The widow Bryce forced to sell her timber claim for pennies. They all got letters. Survey errors. Tax delinquencies. Helpful advice from a friend of the county. Rowan took the letters. The handwriting was the same. The pattern was identical. A web of theft, disguised as bureaucracy, all originating from the courthouse. They walked back to the cold studio in silence. Rowan spread the new letters on the dusty floor, the evidence of a conspiracy that had been strangling this valley for years. Gideon stood by the window, his back to her, staring at the patch of snow-covered ground where his horse was tethered. He's right, Gideon said, his voice so quiet she barely heard it. Morrow Pike. He's right about the fire. Rowan stopped, her hand hovering over a letter. My wife, Gideon said, his voice breaking, raw. Her name was Alara. She was the one who made this place the lodge. She planted the bear flowers. 4 years ago, the sickness came in winter. It took her fast. I'd never seen anything move so fast. He turned, and his eyes were hollow, filled with a winter that had never ended. The doctor from Cheyenne cost $50 a visit. The medicine cost more. I sold my herd. I sold my tack. It wasn't enough. I went to the county fund for a loan. Just $200 to get us through to spring. He pointed at the letters on the floor. Cutter was there, and Pike was there, representing the railroad's interest. They smiled. They said they understood. They gave me the money. I signed the note. I didn't even read it. I just wanted to get back to her. He swallowed, his throat working. She died 2 weeks later. I buried her by the creek, just as the ground thawed, and I was alone. With the debt. The bridge fire, Rowan prompted, her voice gentle. That was a year later, he said, rubbing his face, his hand shaking. I was broken, ashamed. I hadn't told anyone about the note. I was just empty. The railroad was pushing through, and that Blackwood Bridge. It cut off my access to the high pasture. One night, I was drunk. I rode up there, thinking, I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe just to yell at it. He looked at his hands. When I got there, it was already burning. A real fire. Professional. With accelerant, and I saw him, Boyd Ledger, the deputy. He wasn't a deputy then. He was just Pike's man. He was riding away, his face lit by the flames. He saw me. He saw me see him. Gideon laughed, a short, bitter sound. Next day, Pike comes to me. Says it's a terrible accident. Says the railroad knows I was struggling. They offered to help with my note, roll it into a new one. And he mentions he heard I was seen near the fire. He said it would be a shame if the law thought I did it out of spite. He sank onto a dusty crate, his body folding in on itself. So I signed again. I've been signing every time they ask. I've been a coward, hiding on that ridge, letting them own me because I was too ashamed to admit I was a fool, and too scared to tell the truth. Rowan looked at this man, broken not by the land or the winter, but by grief and deceit. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. They didn't just want your land. Gideon, she said, her voice hard as iron. They needed you silent. You're the only one who can place their man at the scene of the fire. They're foreclosing now because you're the last loose end, and they lured me here. What? A stranded woman, a witness. Maybe they thought you'd do something foolish to protect me, something they could use to arrest you. Or maybe, she said, her disgust rising, I was just sport. A way to taunt you one last time. She began to pack her plates. Her movements sharp. We have the proof, the handwriting. We have Mrs. Quill's logbook. We have Mercy and her letters. We have your testimony. It's not enough. Gideon slammed his fist on the crate. It's my word against the judge, the law, and the railroad. They'll say you faked the photographs. They'll say Mrs. Quill is old. They'll say Mercy is just a disgruntled woman. They'll bury us. You're right, Rowan said. She stopped packing. It's not enough. A stack of paper won't convict men like that. We need something they can't deny. We need to show them for what they are. She looked out the window, toward the saloon, where the lights were already coming on, casting a yellow, greasy glow on the snow. They're partners, she said. Cutter and Pike, they're stealing this whole valley, and partners share the profits. Gideon looked at her, uncomprehending. The railroad payroll train arrives tomorrow night, Rowan said, her voice quiet, intense. For the survey crews, Pike will have a bag full of cash, and he will have to pay his partner. Gideon's blood ran cold. The silver latch. Pike's office is in the back. You can't just walk in there. I don't need to walk in, Rowan said. I just need a shot. One clean plate. A picture of Morrow Pike handing money to Judge Ephraim Cutter. A photograph doesn't lie. We show that at the town hall meeting. He stood up, grabbing her arm. His grip was hard, terrified. No, this is too far. This isn't about photography anymore. This is looking down the barrel of a gun. They will kill you. Rowan. It was the first time he had used her name. She did not pull away. She covered his rough, trembling hand with her own, her fingers steady, her gaze unwavering. It was never just about photography. Gideon, she said, it was never just about a fake letter or a bad debt. It's about that fire. It's about Alara. It's about Mercy's mother. It's about the truth you saw and were forced to bury. She looked at him, her eyes holding his. They're counting on you to be scared. They're counting on me to be a victim. I am done being a victim. She gently removed his hand. Tomorrow night, at the Silver Latch, we get the one shot that brings them down. The night of the payroll train. Ash Mesa was a different town. It was no longer a half-buried, snow-choked outpost. It was a vein, and gold standard cash was about to be pumped through it. The Silver Latch Saloon, usually a tomb of quiet desperation, was a roaring, sweating beast. Miners, trappers, and railroad men packed the room shoulder to shoulder, their wet wool steaming in the heat, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, cigar smoke, and unwashed bodies. Rowan felt suffocated. She was dressed in a borrowed gray flannel dress, 2 sizes too large, and a stained white apron Mercy Lowell had provided. Mercy had gotten her the job, explaining to the harassed saloon owner that Rowan was her cousin from the east, slow, but works hard. She was invisible. Her fine-boned features were smudged with a bit of soot, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot. She carried a heavy wooden tray of dirty glasses, her hands shaking so badly the glasses rattled. Across the room, in the darkest corner, sat Gideon. He looked wrong. He had left his heavy greatcoat at the lodge and wore only a worn wool shirt. On his lap, he held a fiddle. It had been Alara's. He had not offered this information, but Rowan knew it from the way he touched it, as if it were a sleeping child. He had offered to play for drinks, and the owner, Sal, had laughed and pointed to the stool. Gideon was her lookout. His job was to watch Deputy Boyd Ledger. Rowan's target was the hallway that led to the back rooms. Pike's office was the last door on the right. She had been inside once, hauling a bucket of dirty water. It was small, with a desk, a safe, and one high, dusty shelf opposite the door, piled with old ledgers. Her camera was already there. She had brought it in piece by piece, hidden in a mop bucket and under her cloak, an hour before the saloon opened. The mahogany box was hidden behind the ledgers, aimed at the desk where the men would sit. The lens was a dark, unblinking eye. The most critical piece was the soft cord, A thin black rubber tube, the pneumatic bulb release. It snaked down from the shelf, behind a peeling strip of wallpaper, and lay coiled on the floor by the doorframe, hidden in the shadows. All she had to do was get to that spot, attach the bulb from her apron pocket, and squeeze. At 10 o'clock, they arrived. Morrow Pike entered first, shaking snow from his buffalo coat, his face red with cold and arrogance. He was followed by a smaller, rat-like man in a city suit, Judge Ephraim Cutter. Deputy Boyd Ledger held the saloon door for them, his hand resting on his pistol, and then followed them back. Pike clapped Ledger on the shoulder. "Keep the door. Boyd, no interruptions." Ledger nodded, taking a post in the hallway, his back to the saloon, his gaze fixed on the office door, which Pike left open just a crack. Gideon saw the problem immediately. Rowan could not get to the hallway, let alone the door, without Ledger seeing her. Rowan saw it too. She was trapped in the main room. She picked up her tray, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She began collecting glasses, her mind racing. She needed a distraction, not just any distraction, but one big enough to pull the deputy from his post. She caught Gideon's eye across the smoky room. She gave a short, sharp nod toward Ledger. "He's in the way." Gideon looked at the deputy. He looked at Rowan. He looked down at the fiddle in his lap. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for just a second, and then lifted the bow. The sound that ripped through the saloon was catastrophic. It was the sound of a dying cat being dragged across a chalkboard. It was a screech, a howl, a violation of noise. Every man in the saloon stopped. Conversations died. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Even the piano player stopped. Gideon Vance, his face a mask of profound, agonizing concentration, dragged the bow across the strings again. "Scree!" a miner in the front row bellowed. "For God's sake, man, what is that supposed to be?" "Oh, Susanna," Gideon said, his voice raw, and he launched into it. He was terrible. He was magnificently, monumentally terrible. He sawed at the strings, hitting notes that had never existed in nature, but he played with a desperate, passionate sincerity, his eyes squeezed shut, his body rocking with the rhythm. The saloon stared for a second, and then it erupted. It was not anger. It was a tidal wave of pure, joyous laughter. Men were banging their fists on tables, tears streaming down their faces. They roared, they whistled, they stamped their feet. Even Boyd Ledger, a man with no humor, cracked a grin. He turned his head, looking back into the saloon at the source of the god-awful noise. "Idiot rancher," he muttered. It was all Rowan needed. With Ledger's back turned, she moved. She didn't run. She walked, smooth and silent, down the hall, her tray of glasses held high. She reached the shadowed doorway. She set the tray down, her movements economical. She knelt, pretending to wipe a spill at the base of the doorframe. Her fingers found the rubber tube. She pulled the bulb from her apron, her hands slick with sweat, and jammed the two pieces together. Inside the room, she could hear Pike's voice, raised over the din of Gideon's fiddle and the saloon's laughter. "A perfect arrangement. Judge, the payroll train unloads. We sign the vouchers for the survey crew, and the hazard pay comes right to us. It's clean." "Pike," Cutter's voice, thin and reedy. "As clean as this snow. Ephraim, here." There was the sound of a heavy thud on the desk. Rowan peered through the crack. It was a canvas mailbag, stenciled with the Granite Plains logo, its top sealed with a red wax GP stamp. Pike took a knife, slit the bag open, and dumped the contents onto the desk. It was a river of cash, bundles of greenbacks, stacks of gold eagles. "You're half judge," Pike said, shoving a stack of bundles across the desk. Cutter reached for it, his thin fingers closing around the money. Rowan held her breath. Her hand, clutching the bulb, was trembling violently. She needed the image sharp. She braced her arm against the wall. She squeezed. The shutter inside the camera made a faint, oiled schlick. It was too quiet to be heard over the noise, but Boyd Ledger, senses honed, felt the vibration, the slight shift in the air, or perhaps he just felt her presence. He turned, his grin vanishing. "What are you doing?" Rowan was still kneeling, a rag in her hand, the bulb hidden in her fist. "Spill, deputy," she said, her voice meek. "Cleaning it up." His eyes narrowed. He looked from her to the tray, to the dark hallway. He didn't trust it. He took a step toward her. Crash in the saloon. Gideon had reached his finale in a fit of musical despair. He had brought the bow down so hard he snapped a string. It recoiled with the sound of a pistol shot. Simultaneously, a miner, laughing too hard, had fallen backward off his stool, taking a table of glasses with him. The saloon erupted again. Boyd swore, his attention yanked back to the chaos. "Pathetic," he snarled. He looked back at Rowan. "Get out, and tell Sal if he lets that fool play again. I'll arrest him for disturbing the peace." Rowan nodded. Her eyes down, she retrieved her tray, leaving the bulb and tube coiled in the shadows, and retreated into the saloon. She moved through the crowd, heading for the back door near the kitchen. Gideon saw her. He set the fiddle down on the empty stool. A drunk miner slapped him on the back. "You're terrible. Vance, play it again." Gideon ignored him, melting into the crowd, following her. Rowan slipped out the back door into the alley. The cold hit her like a punch. She was breathing hard, leaning against the frozen brick, tasting the sharp, metallic air. She had the plate holder. She had retrieved it when she went back for the spill, her hands moving with a speed she did not know she possessed, sliding the dark plate free, hiding it under her apron. Gideon emerged from the shadow. "You got it." "I got it," she breathed. "Pike's men in the alley, they're getting away." It was Boyd's voice, from inside the saloon. Gideon grabbed her hand. "Run!" They ran. The alley was a canyon of blue-black shadow and silver-lit snow. The drifts were deep, sucking at their boots. Rowan's long, wet skirt was a trap, wrapping around her legs. Two men burst from the saloon's back door. They were railroad men, big and bulky. There! A shot cracked through the night. The sound was flat and brutal in the cold. A bullet screamed past Rowan's ear, so close she felt its heat, and struck the brick wall ahead of them, sending up a spray of ice and mortar. Rowan cried out, stumbled, and fell hard, sprawling into a deep, filthy snowbank piled against a wooden fence. The second man raised his pistol, taking aim. "Rowan!" Gideon yelled. He didn't try to help her up. He lunged, grabbing the back of her dress and throwing his body into her, yanking her down and sideways. Thwack! A bullet, heavy and wet, slammed into the wooden fence post, exactly where her head had been a fraction of a second before. Splinters of frozen wood exploded into the air. Gideon rolled, pulling her with him, behind the relative safety of a large hay wagon parked in the alley. They were pinned. They lay pressed against the wagon's frozen wheels, their bodies crushed together in the narrow space. Rowan was on her stomach, Gideon half covering her, his arm hooked around her waist, his rifle, which he had grabbed on his way out. Now, in his hand, they were panting, their breath pluming in the air, mingling. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart hammering against her back. He was warm, a solid, living wall of heat and muscle. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a low growl in her ear. They could hear the men shouting, confused, at the end of the alley. "Where'd they go?" "Check the street." Their boots crunched in the snow, moving away. For a full minute, neither Rowan nor Gideon moved. The only sounds were the fading shouts, the distant, tinny sound of the saloon piano, and their own ragged, desperate breathing. Rowan was acutely aware of his hand, splayed across her back, holding her down, protecting her. She was aware of his thigh pressed against hers, the solid weight of him. In the terror, in the shared metallic taste of adrenaline, something new sparked. Their eyes met in the darkness. He was looking at her not as a stranded passenger, not as ma'am, but as a partner, as a woman who had just walked into the fire with him, She saw in his gaze a fierce, raw admiration that was more potent than any compliment. He eased his weight off her. Now, they moved, staying low, scrambling from the wagon, down the rest of the alley, and into the darkness of the stables. The ride back to Bearflower Lodge was silent, frantic, and cold. They pushed the horses hard, their gaze fixed on the back trail. But no one followed. They were safe. He burst through the door of the lodge first, rifle raised, checking the dark corners. Empty. Rowan followed, bolting the heavy wooden bar. She leaned against the door, her entire body seized by a violent, delayed tremor. Her teeth were chattering. "It's done," she whispered. She pulled the precious dark glass plate holder from beneath her apron, holding it up in the faint moonlight. "The plate is alive." Her laugh was a half-sob. "It's alive." Gideon stared at her, his face a mask of shadows and ice. He put his rifle down. The adrenaline was draining from him, leaving an exhaustion so deep it was a pain. But his eyes were fixed on her, on this impossible, brave, terrifying woman. He took a step toward her. She flinched, still keyed up from the chase. "Easy," he said, his voice rough. He reached out his hand. It was huge, scarred, the knuckles cracked and raw. He did not touch the plate. He did not touch her face. He laid his hand, very gently, on her shoulder. His touch was not proprietary. It was not familiar. It was a question. It was an anchor. It was so light it was barely there, as if he were afraid his own rough-worn texture might break her. Rowan did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, a fraction of an inch, and closed her eyes. The shaking began to subside, replaced by the warmth of his hand seeping through her wet dress. He built the fire, his movements sure and steady, until the stove was roaring, casting a warm, golden light over the room. Rowan huddled on the bear rug, the plate holder clutched in her lap. Gideon did not sit in his chair. He sat on the floor, on the other side of the stove, close enough to share the heat, but far enough to respect the distance. He stared into the flames, his profile carved by the light. "That winter," he said, his voice thick, breaking the silence. When she died, the ground was hard, like iron. It took me 2 days to dig her grave." Rowan watched him, her heart aching. 2 days, he repeated, his voice hollow. "Just me, a pickaxe, and the wind. I buried her, down by the creek. And I think," he paused, swallowing, "I think I buried myself with her. I stayed in that hole. It was cold. It was quiet. It was safe." He turned his head, his tired, blue-gray eyes meeting hers. "I haven't felt warm since then, until tonight." Rowan looked at this man, bared to the bone by his confession. She saw the years of grief and fear he had carried, a weight far heavier than any snow. She moved. She slid across the worn fur of the bear rug, coming to rest beside him. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She did something she had never dared to do. She lifted her hand, her small, chemical-stained, photographer's hand, and laid it flat on his chest. Gideon went rigid. He stopped breathing. He looked down at her hand, dark against his wool shirt, resting just over his heart. She could feel it, a strong, steady thump, alive. "Your heart is still beating, Gideon," she whispered, her gaze holding his. "It's strong." She felt the muscle jump beneath her palm. "It feels," she said, her voice dropping, "big enough for 2. The air in the cabin crackled. The space between them, the formal silence, the entire vast, cold Wyoming territory had all disappeared, shrinking to the few inches between their faces. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was heavy with a new, terrifying, undeniable truth. The plate holder, holding the single most important image of her life, was cold in her lap. Her hand, laid flat against Gideon's chest, was warm. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heart, a counterpoint to the adrenaline still singing in her veins. He had confessed his deepest wound, and she had answered by touching it, by acknowledging the life that still beat beneath the scar tissue of his grief. He did not move. He did not breathe. He simply existed under her touch, his eyes locked on hers, the firelight catching the shattered blue-gray. The silence in the small room stretched, filled only by the hiss of the stove and the faint, distant whine of the wind, which had begun to rise again. Rowan shivered. The tremor began deep in her center and radiated outward, a violent rattling of her bones. It was the aftermath of the chase, the wet clothes chilling her skin, the terror, and the profound, terrifying intimacy of this moment. Her hand trembled against his chest. His gaze softened. The intensity broke, replaced by a simple, practical concern. "You're cold," he said. His voice was thick. He moved, and her hand fell away, leaving her skin suddenly empty. He rose in one fluid motion, not with the angry energy of before, but with a new, quiet purpose. He went to the ladder, climbed to the loft, and retrieved the heavy wool blanket he had given her the first night. He came back to her, not sitting, but kneeling in front of her on the worn bear rug. The blanket was clean, smelling faintly of dried pine and smoke. He unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders, his movements deliberate, his large, rough hands careful not to graze her skin. But as he pulled the edges of the blanket together, tucking it around her neck, his fingertips brushed the cold skin of her jaw. It was a spark in a tinder, dry forest. A jolt, sharp and clean, that arced from that single point of contact, down her spine, and pooled, hot, in her stomach. Her breath caught in her throat. His hand froze. He had felt it too. He didn't pull away. His fingers lingered, his thumb resting for a bare second on the pulse that beat frantically just below her ear. She leaned into the touch, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, a flower turning toward a sliver of sun. He let his hand fall, but he did not move away. He sat back on his heels, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if seeing her for the first time. The soot, the damp, tangled hair, the exhaustion. You're not like anyone," he started, his voice rough, and then stopped, as if the words were foreign, untranslated. Rowan felt a strange courage, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Her eyes fell to his hand, the one that had rested on her shoulder. A long, white scar ran from his knuckle to his wrist, a pale roadmap of past pain, still wrapped in the cocoon of his blanket. She reached out her own hand, slowly, giving him every chance to pull away. She traced the length of the scar with her forefinger. His skin was calloused, hot. He flinched, but did not move. "What's this one?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He looked down at her finger on his hand. "Barbed wire," he said, his voice quiet. "A foolish shortcut in a blizzard. 2 years back, the wire snapped. Took me 3 hours to get back to the lodge, holding my hand together. You stitched it yourself," she stated. She could feel the telltale ridge of a clumsy, desperate suture. "Had to," he said simply. She heard the unsaid words. There was no one else to do it. He had been alone, bleeding, in this room, fighting for his life, while she had been 1,000 miles away. A different person. He had survived. He had endured. She looked up, her hand still resting on his, and saw that he was listening. Not to her words, but to her. He was watching her breathe, as if the simple rise and fall of her chest was a miracle he had forgotten. The air in the lodge was thick, charged, vibrating with all the things they had not said, with a shared danger, with the simple, undeniable fact of their alikeness. He had been frozen in his past, she had been running toward an unknown future, and they had collided, here, in the dead of winter, in a room lit by a single fire. He knew. He saw the shift in her eyes, the slight parting of her lips, and the fear returned to his face, not of her, but for her. Fear of doing this wrong. He leaned forward, his voice a raw whisper, his gaze searching hers, giving her the anchor of the choice. "Rowan," he said, the name a fresh, new sound in the room. "If you feel unsafe, if I am wrong, I will stop. I will go back to my chair, and I will not move until morning. You just have to say the word." It was the most honest, vulnerable thing he could have offered. He was giving her all the power. He was telling her that her safety, her will, was more important than the terrible, aching loneliness he had carried for 4 years. Rowan looked at this man, the silent rancher, the supposed coward, the widower trapped by ghosts, and she saw none of those things. She saw the man who had respected her camera, who had fought the storm on the roof, who had played a fiddle to save her, and who was now offering her the ultimate respect. She did not pull away. She did not look down. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I am not unsafe," she whispered. "I choose to stay." The breath he had been holding escaped him in a long, shaky sigh. It was permission. It was acceptance. He reached for her, his hands strong. He did not lift her. He simply put his hands on her waist, his thumbs resting on her hip bones, and gently, slowly, pulled her forward with him, guiding them both down onto the thick, worn fur of the bear rug. He settled her on her side, facing the fire, and lay beside her, propped on one elbow. The firelight danced across her face. He was so close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the clean, sharp scent of pine smoke and cold air that clung to him. With his free hand, he reached out, not for her face, not for her body, but for her back. He laid his palm flat against her spine, over the damp flannel of her dress. Then, with a touch that was agonizingly slow, he drew a single line with his finger, from the base of her neck all the way down to the small of her back. Rowan's back arched. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, ripped through her. Her breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp. It was the answer he was looking for. He moved, shifting his body until he was leaning over her. His other hand came up, not to hold, but to cradle. He cupped her jaw, his calloused thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek, tilting her face toward his. He looked into her eyes. He was asking again, silently, and she answered by closing the last inch between them. The first kiss was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, desperate relief. It was the taste of smoke and tea and the metallic tang of fear. It was hesitant, his lips dry and chapped, brushing against hers as if relearning a lost language. It was a question. Rowan answered, her lips softening, parting slightly, her own hand coming up to rest on his shoulder. It was acceptance. The kiss changed. It deepened. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a slow, rising heat, a warmth that started in her chest and spread, thawing all the frozen places inside her. It was the undoing of a long, cold winter. It was the opposite of the violence and fear they had just escaped. It was slow. It was sure. His hand moved from her jaw, sliding to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the damp, loose strands of her hair. He held her, not to capture, but to support, to anchor her. His other arm wrapped around her back, pulling her flush against his chest, until there was no space, no cold, no world left between them. Her own arms wrapped around his strong, solid back, her fingers gripping his wool shirt. She held on to him as she had held on to the roof in the storm. He was real. He was solid ground. There was no hurry. There was no fumbling. This was not the desperate grab of lonely people. It was a slow, deliberate discovery. They moved together, finding a rhythm that was as old as the mountains, as elemental as the fire beside them. They paused, pulling back just enough to breathe, to look at each other in the flickering light. A small, shared smile of wonder passing between them, before leaning in again. The only sounds were the rising howl of the second storm outside, a wild counterpoint to the quiet safety within, the pop and crackle of the stove, the whisper of their own breathing. The heavy wool blanket he had wrapped her in puddled around her waist. As he shifted to deepen the kiss, his arm brushing her shoulder, the blanket slipped, sliding from her shoulders and pooling behind her, a dark wool shadow on the dark fur rug. It was as soft and silent as a leaf falling in its proper season. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but inside, there was only the circle of their warmth. After a long time, The kiss softened, gentling from heat to a deep, simmering warmth. He did not pull away, but rested his forehead against hers. They lay like that, side by side on the rug, tangled in each other's arms, breathing the same air. His eyes were closed. Rowan smiled, a small, tired, profoundly happy smile. She felt a tear slip, hot, from the corner of her eye. "I am still me," she whispered, the words spoken against his skin. He opened his eyes. His gaze was clear, the hollow exhaustion gone, replaced by a deep, steady light. He understood what she meant, that this moment, this surrender, had not erased the woman who held the camera, the woman who fought for the truth. He kissed her forehead, a gentle press of his lips. "And you are your own, first," he whispered back, his voice thick. "Always." It was a vow, a promise of respect that was more intimate than any touch. She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she stepped off the train. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. The fire began to die down, the roaring flames settling into a deep, pulsating bed of red-gold embers, like a field of late stars. They did not speak again. They simply lay, two survivors, two partners, holding each other in the heart of the storm. It was safe. It was respectful. And for the first time in 4 years, Gideon Vance was not alone. For the first time in her life. Rowan Hale felt truly, completely whole. The lodge was filled with the gray, pre-dawn light, a cold and sterile illumination that seemed to bleach the very air. Rowan had not slept. She had lain on the bare rug, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the rhythm of Gideon's breathing from the chair he had insisted on retaking. The intimacy of the night before had settled, not into awkwardness, but into a shared, silent gravity. They had a life to save his, and a truth to exhume theirs. As the first faint light touched the snow-crusted window, she rose. Gideon was already awake, his eyes on her, the rifle across his lap. He had not slept either. "I have to do it now," she said. He understood. He nodded, rising to poke the stove, bringing a dull red glow to the iron. "The light," she said. "It cannot touch the plate until it's fixed. Tell me what to do." The windows, every crack. For the next 20 minutes, they worked with the efficient, silent choreography of partners. They hung every spare blanket, every piece of canvas, over the 2 windows and the door, plunging the room into a thick, absolute darkness. Rowan lit her small red lantern, the kind used in dark rooms, and the single room was transformed into a strange, crimson-lit cave. Their faces were masks of red shadow. She unpacked her chemicals, the sharp, acidic smell of the collodion mingling with the scent of pine smoke. Her hands were steady. This was her element. She took the precious glass plate holder, the one she had guarded all night, and held it over the tin developing tray. "This is the moment," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She slid the glass negative out. It looked blank, an opaque, creamy gray. She poured the pyrogallic acid developer over it, her wrist moving in a perfect, practiced motion. Gideon watched, his breath held, as if she were a surgeon and the plate a living heart. "Count," she said. "1," he said, his voice a low rumble. 2, 3. She rocked the tray gently. At the count of 15, she raised the plate. Nothing, just the gray film. Her heart seized. "It's blank," Gideon said, his voice flat with despair. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "It's slow. The cold." She poured the developer off and held the plate. "Wait." She poured the fixer, the sodium thiosulfate, over the glass. The liquid was sharp and cold. They waited. The seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. The room was so quiet she could hear the blood in her own ears. And then, like a ghost rising from a winter fog, it appeared, first, the dark shapes of the room, then the bright, overexposed shape of the lamp on the desk, and then the men, Pike, his arm extended, Cutter, his fingers curled around the money, the canvas bag, its GP logo sharp and clear. My God, Gideon breathed, leaning closer. It's them. It's true. Rowan let out a breath she had been holding since she squeezed the bulb. She plunged the plate into the water bath, washing away the fixer, her hands shaking now that the work was done. We have them, she said, her voice trembling with a cold, hard triumph. She held the glass plate up. A clear, perfect negative. A moment of pure villainy captured in silver and glass. And now, we show them. They rode to Ash Mesa as the sun cleared the ridges, the world a painful, blinding white. The alliance was forged. They moved with a single purpose. Their first stop was Mercy Lowell's small room behind the tannery. She was waiting, her face calm and composed. Beside her sat three others, a gaunt farmer named Hemlock, the widow Bryce, and a young Mexican ranch hand whose family had lost their water rights. Rowan didn't show them the new photograph. Not yet. She laid her double-exposed plates of the handwriting comparison on Mercy's small table. I have this, Rowan said. Proof that the signatures were forged. Mercy looked at the plates, then at the faces of her small, terrified congregation. They are afraid to speak. Mrs. Hale, their words are all they have, and Cutter owns the court. My words, too, Gideon said, his voice quiet, drawing all eyes. He owns my words. He's held a threat over me for 3 years. At the town hall meeting on Sunday, I am going to speak. I am going to tell the truth. About my debt, about the fire at the bridge, about all of it. He looked at Mercy. Your words, added to mine, added to theirs. It becomes a rope, Mercy, strong enough to hang them. Mercy saw the change in him. This was not the broken man who hid on the mountain. This was a man who had chosen a side. I will be there, Mercy said, her voice firm. And I will bring their testimony. Their next stop was the telegraph office. Mrs. Tansy Quill was sweeping her boardwalk, her movements brisk. Mrs. Hale. She nodded. Mr. Vance. Rowan produced the negative, wrapped in a dark cloth. She unveiled it in the shadow of the office. Mrs. Quill put on her spectacles. She stared at the image of Pike and Cutter for a full 10 seconds. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. Well, bless my wires, she whispered. You did it, you little firefly? You actually did it. Will you testify? Mrs. Quill, Rowan asked. About the logbook about Cutter sending the wire that lured me here? Testify, Mrs. Quill laughed, a dry, crackling sound. Child, I will read it from the roof of the church. The town hall meeting is Sunday, at noon. It's supposed to be about the spring cattle ordinance. It's about to be a whole lot more. Back at the lodge, the plan took shape. Gideon galvanized, went to the locked wooden cabinet, the one that held his secrets. He no longer looked at the papers with shame. He looked at them with Rowan's critical, forensic eye. Rowan, he said, his voice tight. He was holding his original 3-year-old loan document. Look at this, the seal. He pointed to the red wax seal at the bottom, next to his signature. It's the county fund, but it's not the county seal. I've seen the county seal on tax receipts. It's a star. This is an eagle. It's the railroad seal, pressed into the wax. It was crude. It was arrogant. It proved the loan was never a county matter. It was Pike's trap, from the very beginning. It's another nail, Rowan said. Gideon, you will tell them everything. You will hold that paper up. You will show them the lie, and you will wrap yourself in the truth before Pike can use it as a weapon. But the photograph, he said. It's small. People in the back won't see it. They'll say it's a trick. No, Rowan said, a fierce light in her eyes. They will see it. I have another piece of equipment, a magic lantern. She pointed to a wooden box in her kit. It's a projector. I can make a positive slide from this negative. We will hang a sheet in the town hall, and I will show them their judge and their foreman, 10 feet high, for all the world to see. The knock came 2 hours later. It was not a knock. It was a boot kicking the door. Gideon Vance, open this door in the name of the law. It was Boyd Ledger's voice. Gideon and Rowan looked at each other. The negative. The real one. It was sitting on the table, Gideon moved, his face a mask of cold fury. He grabbed the negative, but Rowan was faster. She snatched it, ran to the dry goods shelf, and plunged her hand into the open tin of cornmeal. She buried the glass plate deep, smoothing the yellow meal over the top. Gideon shoved the tin back onto the shelf just as the door burst open. Boyd Ledger stood there, flanked by 3 rough-looking men wearing hastily pinned deputy badges. They were railroad men. "Vance," Boyd sneered. "We have a warrant, suspicion of conspiracy to defraud the county, and we're here to search the premises for illegal photographic equipment and materials." He had smelled the chemicals from town. "You'll find nothing," Gideon said, his voice dangerously low. "We'll see." Boyd and his men tore the small lodge apart. They overturned the table, ripped the blankets from the loft, scattered the tin plates. One man kicked open the stove, sending embers onto the floor. Rowan watched, her hands clenched, her face pale but resolute. "It's not here," Boyd growled, his eyes falling on the cornmeal tin. He walked toward it. Rowan's heart stopped. He was reaching for it when his gaze shifted to the barn. "It's a small plate. It could be anywhere. Check the barn." He marched out the door, his men following. "No," Rowan whispered, moving to follow. Gideon put his arm out, stopping her. "Let me." They followed Ledger into the dim, cold barn. The deputy was prodding hay bales with his rifle barrel. "Nothing here, boss," one of the men said. Boyd's eyes fell on Iron Dusk. The horse was watching him, his ears pinned back, his eyes showing white. He remembered the night of the storm. "Check the stall," Boyd ordered, gesturing to the back. As the man moved toward the stall, Rowan stepped forward. "Be careful," she called out, her voice high and sharp. "He's not stable." The sudden sound, the memory of fear, the smell of the intruders, it was too much for Iron Dusk. As Boyd himself stepped past the stall door, the horse exploded. With a high-pitched, terrifying scream, Iron Dusk reared, his great body twisting, his front hooves lashing out over the stall door. He was not aiming for anyone. He was just blind with terror. Boyd Ledger yelled and dove backward, landing unceremoniously in a pile of wet straw. His deputies scrambled back, their faces white. "Get out!" Gideon roared, grabbing a pitchfork and advancing, not toward the men, but toward the stall, placing his body between them and his horse. "Get out of my barn before you get yourselves killed. He'll trample you. Get out!" Boyd, humiliated and covered in filth, scrambled to his feet. He had lost control. He looked at the wild-eyed horse, at Gideon holding the pitchfork, and at Rowan, who was standing by the door, her face a mask of false concern. "This isn't over. Vance," he spat, backing out of the barn. "We'll be at that meeting, and you'd better have a good story." They mounted their horses and rode away, a fast, angry retreat. Rowan and Gideon stood in the violated silence of the barn, their breath pluming in the air. Iron Dusk snorted, calming, and nudged Gideon's shoulder. "Good boy," Gideon murmured, his hands shaking as he stroked the horse's neck. Rowan walked back into the lodge. The cornmeal tin was untouched. She took it from the shelf. "This is not safe," she said, her voice low. Gideon took the tin from her. "I know." He took a shovel from the wall. He went back into the barn, to the stall. He calmed Iron Dusk, moving him aside. He knelt, pried up one of the heavy floorboards, and began to dig in the cold, dry earth beneath. He wrapped the tin in an old piece of oilcloth, placed it in the hole, and buried it. He tamped the earth, replaced the floorboard, and kicked the straw back over it. "Let the horse guard it," he said. That night, as they sat at the righted table, planning their speeches for the next day, a piece of paper slid under the door. Gideon picked it up. Scrawled in crude, block letters were 8 words. "Don't drag light into dark places. You'll get burnt." Rowan read it, a cold chill running down her spine. Gideon stared at the warning. He looked at Rowan, at the quiet strength in her face, and then he walked to the stove. He opened the iron door and dropped the note onto the hot coals. They watched it curl, blacken, and turn to white ash. "The darkness has lived here long enough," he said. Rowan nodded. She was packing a small box. Inside, she placed a single, perfect positive print she had made from the negative, and a small, carefully wrapped positive slide for the magic lantern. "I need you to ride," she said. "Where?" "South, to Cheyenne, to the Aspen Sentinel newspaper. Give this print to the night editor. Tell him if he wants the biggest story in Wyoming. He'll be at the Ash Mesa Town Hall tomorrow at noon, and to bring a federal marshal." He looked at her, a slow, dawning admiration in his eyes. "Insurance." "I'll be back by dawn," he said, and went to Saddle Iron dusk. It was noon on Sunday. The town hall was packed, hot and smelling of wet wool and nervous sweat. Rowan stood at the back, near her magic lantern, which was hidden under a canvas sheet. Gideon was near the front, with Mercy Lowell and her small, brave group. Cutter and Pike were at the front, looking confident. Boyd Ledger was at the door, his hand on his gun. Rowan's hands were freezing. She was rubbing them together, her breath short. "Gideon," she whispered, as he passed her to take his seat. "What if it's not enough? What if they laugh at us? What if they just win? I've lost everything before. I don't know if I can do it again." Gideon stopped. He took her small, cold hands in his own. They were large, warm, and rock-steady. He didn't speak until she met his eyes. "Rowan," he said, his voice so quiet only she could hear it, but as solid as the mountains. "Look at me. If we lose, if they burn this building down and run us out of the territory, I still have you. I'm not in that cold ground anymore. That's the truth. We already won that." He squeezed her hands. A fierce, bright light she had never seen before lit his eyes. "But I choose to win." The town hall was not a courtroom. It was a large, drafty room built of green pine, and it smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and the stove in the corner, which was fighting a losing battle against the cold. Every seat was taken. Men stood 3 deep against the back wall, their faces hardened by the snow and by suspicion. This was their land, and they were here to defend the small parts of it they still owned. At a raised table at the front, Judge Ephraim Cutter presided, his face a mask of judicial boredom. To his right, Morrow Pike stood with his arms crossed over his chest, looking more like an indulgent landlord than a man about to be accused. By the main door, his bulk filling the frame, Deputy Boyd Ledger watched the crowd, his hand never straying far from the polished handle of his revolver. "This meeting is called to order," Cutter said, his voice thin, striking the table with a small wooden gavel. "The first item on the agenda is the spring grazing ordinance. Point of order. Judge." The voice cut through the room, clear and steady. It was not loud, but it silenced every murmur. Gideon Vance, he was standing in the center aisle. He was not the hermit of Blue Badger today. He was clean-shaven, his hair was combed, and he wore a clean, dark wool shirt. He looked like the man he must have been 5 years ago. "This is not a point of order. Mr. Vance," Cutter said, his eyes narrowing. "This is an interruption. I am here to speak on a matter of public theft," Gideon said, walking steadily toward the front. "It concerns the county fund, the Granite and Plains Railroad, and the man you appointed to oversee them." Pike uncrossed his arms. "Gideon, we've all had a hard winter. Don't come in here with your personal grievances and waste these good folks' time." "My grievance is their grievance," Gideon said. He stopped 10 feet from the table. "I am here to make a confession. I am here to tell you all that I have been a coward. I have been leveraged by these men for 3 years, blackmailed into silence about the fire at the Blackwood Bridge." The room inhaled. "The fire? The rumor that had haunted the valley? That's a slanderous accusation," Cutter snapped, his face turning mottled red. "You are bordering on contempt. And I," a new voice called out, clear and sharp from the back of the hall, "have the proof." Every head turned. Rowan Hale stood beside a table. On it was a strange contraption of brass, polished wood, and glass lenses. She struck a long match. the scrape echoing in the sudden, absolute silence. She lit the oil lamp inside the device. A bright, white square of light shot through the dusty, hot air, striking a clean white sheet that had been hung on the far wall. "What in God's name is this?" Pike laughed, though his eyes were fixed on the machine. "Are we at a circus?" "Ma'am. A magic show." "In a way," Rowan said. She slid a thin, 4-inch square piece of glass into the lantern's holder. The light on the sheet dissolved, then focused. It was an image, black and white, 10 feet high. A room, a desk, 2 men, a collective gasp. A low, animal sound rose from the crowd. It was them, Morrow Pike, his arm extended, Judge Ephraim Cutter, his fingers curled around a thick stack of greenbacks. The canvas bag, its GP logo sharp as a brand, sat between them. That's the payroll," a man in the front whispered, his voice cracking. "It's a lie," Cutter shrieked, rising from his chair. He was white as the snow outside. "It's a trick of the light. A forgery, it's a magic show. That woman is a charlatan. Boyd, seize that machine." Ledger started to move, but the crowd, their faces turning from curiosity to a slow, cold fury, blocked his path. "A trick, Judge." Rowan's voice was like ice. "It's hard to forge the truth, but I know a forgery when I see one." She removed the slide and, with a steady hand, inserted a second one. The image on the wall shifted. Now, it was just words. 2 signatures, one laid over the other, their lines intersecting. Morrow Pike, Silas Croft. "The signature on Mr. Vance's foreclosure notice," Rowan said, her voice ringing with clarity. "And the signature on the fraudulent marriage letter sent to me. A letter, I might add, that was ordered and paid for at the telegraph office by Judge Cutter himself." "That's a fact, Mrs." Tansy Quill marched up the aisle, her logbook held high like a Bible. "I have the log October 17th, 1887, $10, paid in cash by Cutter's runner, to send that very wire. He lured this woman here." The room was turning. The men were on their feet, their faces dark. This was not a private grievance. This was a conspiracy that had touched them all. "He didn't just write 2 letters," a new voice said. Mercy Lowell stepped into the aisle. She was not alone. Behind her stood the widow Bryce, old man Hemlock, and the young ranch hand, their face pale but resolute. "My mother," Mercy said, her voice shaking but clear, "was forced off her land by a survey error letter. I have it. It is his hand." The widow Bryce held up her own paper. "My timber claim, stolen by a helpful letter from a friend of the county." It was Pike's hand. The crowd was a single, growling entity. They were advancing on the stage, their sense of betrayal a tangible, dangerous thing. Pike saw it. He saw the room, the law, the entire county slipping from his grasp. He looked at Cutter, whose face had collapsed in terror. He looked at Boyd Ledger, who was trapped by the door. He gave a single, almost invisible nod. Ledger, trapped, shoved his way through the men, burst out the front door, and vanished. Pike turned to the crowd, raising his hands. "Now, hold on. This is a misunderstanding. This is what happens when hysterical women and failed ranchers are given a voice." Whoomp! A low, muffled explosion from outside. Then, a man's voice, screaming in pure terror. "Fire! The stables are on fire!" The panic was instant and absolute. The meeting was over. These men's horses, their wagons, their very livelihoods were tied to that rail. "My team!" a man shouted, shoving his way to the door. "They'll burn!" The hall emptied in a chaotic surge of bodies, men grabbing coats and buckets, their fury at Pike instantly replaced by the more immediate terror of the flames. "It's a diversion," Gideon roared, grabbing Rowan's arm. "My camera!" she cried, but he was already pulling her. "The negative. Rowan, the real one is in the barn." They ran, pushing through the panicked crowd. Outside, the air was thick with oily, black smoke. The livery stable, 50 yards down, was already a tower of flames, the dry old wood crackling. the sound of horses screaming from within. "They didn't just set a fire," Gideon said, his face ashen, grabbing an axe. "They're trying to destroy the evidence." He looked at the other ranchers. "My barn is next, they'll burn the whole town." He and 3 other ranchers, their faces grim, ran toward his barn, which stood between the livery and the rest of the town. Rowan was left standing in the doorway of the half-empty town hall. Through the smoke, she could see Pike by the fire, not helping, but directing his men, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Cutter was stuffing papers into a briefcase, his eyes darting toward the side door. And then Boyd Ledger was there. He had come back. He walked into the town hall, his face streaked with soot. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was walking directly toward Rowan. "The show's over," he said, his voice a low snarl. He pulled his revolver. He was not aiming at her. He was aiming at the magic lantern, at the slides, at the last remaining proof in this room. "That thing," he said, "is a menace, inciting a riot. I'm impounding it." He cocked the hammer, the sound a deadly, final click. Rowan looked at the gun. She looked at the man. She looked at her machine. She did not scream. She did not run. She stepped directly in front of the lens, her hands spread wide, her small body shielding her work. "No," she said. "Get out of the way, woman." He spat, his eyes cold. "You're obstructing the law." He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her skin, and threw her to the floor. He raised the pistol, ready to smash the machine, to fire into the lens. "She is the law. Boyd." Gideon's voice. He was standing in the doorway, framed against the swirling snow and smoke. He was breathing hard, his face black with soot. The barn was safe. For now. Boyd spun, his gun coming up, leveling at Gideon's chest. "You're done, Vance. You're under arrest." Gideon held no rifle. His hands were empty. He was a rancher, not a gunman. He moved. As Boyd sighted down the barrel, Gideon dove to the side, grabbing the nearest thing, a heavy, straight-backed oak chair. Boyd fired. The explosion was deafening in the small room. The bullet tore through the air where Gideon had been, shattering the wall. Before he could fire again, Gideon swung the chair. He did not aim for the head. He swung it in a low, hard arc, with all the strength of a man who splits wood and hauls roofs. The heavy oak slammed into Boyd's gun arm and hip. There was a wet, sickening crack of bone. Boyd screamed, a high, thin sound, and his pistol clattered across the floorboards. He collapsed against the wall, his arm hanging at an impossible angle, his face a mask of white, agonizing pain. The room was suddenly silent, filled only with the deputy's ragged groans and the distant shouts from the fire. Gideon let the chair fall. He was panting, his eyes fixed on the man he had just broken. Cutter saw his chance. He bolted, briefcase in hand, for the side door. He threw it open and ran. "Judge Ephraim Cutter." A new voice, a voice of iron. It came from the main door. 2 men stood there, their coats heavy with snow, their faces hard. They wore the badges of United States Marshals. Behind them, a 3rd man, holding a notepad and pencil, his eyes wide, the editor from the Aspen Sentinel. Cutter froze, 1 foot out the door. The lead marshal ignored him and looked at Pike, who was just walking back from the fire, his face confident. "Morrow, Pike," the marshal boomed, his voice cutting through the smoke. "You are under arrest by authority of the federal government for conspiracy, mail fraud, and incitement to arson." Pike's face dissolved. His railroad authority, his county influence, it all vanished. Cutter, seeing the badges, seeing Pike's world end, made a final, panicked lurch for the door. He was so terrified he didn't see the white sheet, pulled down in the chaos, tangled on the floor. He tripped. He fell, hard, his face hitting the plank floor, the briefcase flying from his hand. He became hopelessly, pathetically tangled in the white cotton sheet, the very shroud that had shown his crimes. He was just a small, old man, wrapped for his own burial. Outside, the shouts of the firefighters died down, replaced by a new sound. Clang, 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 slow, deep, and rhythmic. It was the church bell. It was not an alarm. It was a proclamation. Mrs. Tansy Quill, her duty done, was in the bell tower, letting the entire painted basin know. It was not a sound of victory. It was the sound of a community, having just seen the sickness, saving itself. Rowan, her arm already bruising where Boyd had grabbed her, pushed herself to her feet. She walked past the groaning deputy, past Gideon, who was watching the marshals cuff Pike. She walked to her magic lantern. Her hand was shaking, the adrenaline, the fall, the terror. But as she reached inside and carefully, reverently, retrieved the hot glass slide, the tremor stopped. She held the image up to the light. Pike and Cutter, the money. It was so small in her hand, yet it had torn down a kingdom. A faint, tired smile touched her lips. Her photograph was no longer just a shadow. It was evidence. It was truth. And it was free. The silence that fell in the town hall was heavier than the snow outside. It was a vacuum, left by the sudden exit of chaos. Pike was in irons, his face a mask of disbelief. Cutter, unwrapped from the sheet by a grim-faced marshal, was a trembling, diminished old man. Boyd Ledger sat against the wall, his broken arm clutched to his chest, his authority gone. The editor from the Aspen Sentinel was scribbling furiously, his pencil flying across the page. He was capturing the faces of the crowd, the stunned, slow-dawning relief on the faces of Hemlock and the widow Bryce. He was capturing the quiet, fierce dignity of Mercy Lowell as she stood with her hands clasped. Gideon and Rowan stood near the door, side by side, watching the marshals lead the conspirators out into the snow. The fire at the livery was dying, the shouts replaced by the hiss of steam and the chop of axes as men fought the last embers. The foreclosure was nullified by the federal marshal before he even left town. The original loan, with its forged railroad seal, was seized as evidence for the federal case against Pike and Cutter. The fraudulent foreclosure notice was torn in half by the marshal himself, a symbolic act that unbound not just Gideon, but the entire valley. Cinder Creek, the lifeblood of the ranch, belonged to Gideon Vance once more. The news spread faster than the fire had. Pike and Cutter were transferred to Cheyenne to await a federal trial. The railroad, facing a wave of indictments and the Aspen Sentinel's front-page story, complete with a stunning engraving based on Rowan's photograph, publicly disavowed Pike and withdrew all claims in the painted basin. The shadow that had covered the valley for 3 years had lifted. The following Saturday, the sound of hammering echoed up from the Blue Badger Ranch, but it was not Gideon. Working alone, a dozen men from Ash Mesa had ridden out at dawn, their wagons loaded with fresh-cut pine, new roofing sod, and boxes of nails. They were led by Hemlock. They were rebuilding Gideon's barn, not just the storm patch, but the whole structure, shoring up the walls, replacing the rotted supports, and adding a new sound roof. It was an apology, written in sweat and timber. It was the community welcoming its lost member back. Gideon worked alongside them, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face set in a look of quiet disbelief. He had been the outcast, the man who hid, the valley's ghost. And here was the valley, giving him back his home. Rowan, her arm bruised but healing, spent the day hauling buckets of hot coffee and biscuits. She watched as these hard, silent men who had viewed her with suspicion only a week before, now nodded to her, their eyes filled with a new, profound respect. On the porch of the lodge, a new life was taking root. Mercy Lowell sat on a stool, a copy of the Aspen Sentinel spread on her knees. She was surrounded by 3 children, 2 of Hemlock's and 1 from the tannery. She was patiently pointing to the words, her finger moving beneath the headline. "This," she said, her voice clear and proud, "says truth. And this," she tapped the byline, "says hail." She taught us that one word can free another. The children, their faces rapt, repeated the letters. A new school had begun, born of courage. Nearby, Mrs. Tansy Quill had a small telegraph key, a practice set, wired to a battery. She was tapping out rhythms. Dit-dit-dit, da-da-da. The rancher's children were tapping back on the wooden porch rail, their laughter sharp and bright. They were learning the sound of information, the language of connection. The next week, Rowan hung a new sign on the porch, painted on a smooth piece of pine. Gideon had steadied the plank while she'd painted the letters, her hand sure and precise. It did not read like the sign of a stranded passenger. It read, "Hail Vance. Photographs, authentications." Her first act of business was to fulfill a promise. She set up her camera in the weak spring sun and took portraits of Mercy, the widow Bryce, and Hemlock's family. She did not charge them. She gave them the glass plates, their own histories, their own proof of existence. She was no longer just capturing the truth. She was giving it back. Her most difficult subject was Iron Dusk. The horse, still skittish from the fire and the attack, shied from the black cloth and the strange, three-legged machine. "He'll never stand," Gideon said, holding the bridle, the horse dancing nervously. "He will," Rowan said. She did not approach the horse. She approached Gideon. She put her hand on his arm, right next to the horse's head. "He trusts you, and I trust you. Just stand with him. Breathe." She went back to her camera. Gideon stood, his hand on the horse's neck, his voice a low, steady murmur. Rowan watched them, this man and this horse, both survivors, both learning to trust again. She draped the black cloth over her head. "Now," she whispered. She uncapped the lens, and in that moment, Iron Dusk, feeling the calm from Gideon's hand, let out a long, whooshing breath and relaxed, his upper lip curling back in what looked, for all the world, like a great, goofy grin. Rowan capped the lens, her own laughter muffled by the cloth, the resulting photograph, the terrifying horse, smiling. With the once terrifying rancher at his side became a quiet legend in Ash Mesa. It was proof that the long winter was finally, truly, over. That night, the work was done. The lodge was quiet. The new roof was solid over their heads. A light spring wind, no longer a threat, whispered at the door, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new pine. Rowan and Gideon sat on the bear rug, their backs against the wall, shoulders touching. They were sharing a pot of black tea, passing the tin cup back and forth. The fire crackled, a comfortable, domestic sound. "Mercy's school," Gideon said, his voice quiet. "It's a good thing. She's a light." "She is," Rowan said. "So is Mrs. Quill. This valley is changing. Gideon, we changed it." He was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, at the firelight on her face, at the small, permanent silver nitrate stains on her hands. "We need to talk about family. Rowan," he said, his voice hesitant. She looked at him. "I thought we were—" "No," he said. He took a breath. "I mean, what comes next? I am not a rich man. Pike made sure of that. The letter you got, it was a lie. This." He gestured around the small, clean room. "This is it. The land is ours, but it's hard land. It's a life of work, of getting up before the sun, of fighting the winter, of lighting the fire for each other, every single morning." Rowan smiled, a small, soft smile. "It sounds warm, Gideon." He nodded. He had been leading up to this. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, was clenched. He slowly opened it. I went to the cabinet," he said, his voice thick. Rowan looked. The cabinet that had held his debt, his shame. It was empty. After the marshals took the papers, it was just an empty box. So I thought I should put something new in it, something that belongs to us. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He placed it in her open palm. It was a ring. It was not gold or silver. It was dark, heavy iron, forged and twisted into a simple, perfect circle. It was still rough, the hammer marks visible. It's a horseshoe nail," he stammered, his face flushing, the words clumsy. "From Iron Dusk. I forged it myself, in the fire, after the men left. It's not what you came here for. It's not fine. It's strong," she whispered, her fingers closing around it. It was heavy. It was real. Gideon looked at her, his heart in his eyes. He did not kneel. He did not make a grand speech. He just sat beside her, his hand open and empty, having given her the only thing he had made. "I'm not asking you to be a rancher's wife, Rowan," he said, his voice rough. "I'm asking you to be you, here, with me. If you want, we'll call this place home." Rowan's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of a deep, profound recognition. This was the truth she had been searching for. She looked from the ring, heavy in her hand, to the man beside her. She looked down at the worn fur of the bear rug beneath them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's been home, Gideon," she whispered. She slipped the iron ring onto her finger. It was a perfect, snug fit. She reached out, her hand tracing the line of his jaw. "It's been home, ever since that night, the night you pulled me down onto this rug." She smiled, a small, secret smile, and he felt the shiver of her touch. "You reminded me," she said, her voice dropping, "that my back could still shiver, for happiness, not just from the cold." He let out a ragged breath, and for the first time, a full, true laugh rumbled in his chest. He put his arm around her, pulling her close, and she laughed with him, a sound of pure, unburdened relief. He leaned over and opened the cabin door, just a crack. The breeze that entered was cool, and it carried the sharp, clean scent of the pine forest and the comforting smell of the wood smoke from their own chimney. It was the scent of a life, lived slowly, together. "We'll have the wedding," he said, his voice muffled in her hair. "After the haying season, when the work is in." "And the invitation?" she asked. "Simple," he said. He kissed the top of her head. "We'll just write 2 words. Come eat." And the rest. They knew. The town would understand. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was a place of high, vaulted ceilings and polished oak, a world away from the raw pine and mud chinking of the Ash Mesa town hall. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the cold, thin air of absolute authority. Morrow, Pike, and Ephraim Cutter sat at the defendant's table, flanked by expensive lawyers from the East. They looked smaller here, their railroad arrogance and judicial power stripped away, leaving only 2 pale, aging men in ill-fitting suits. Rowan Hale was the first witness for the prosecution. She did not speak with the tremor of a victim. She spoke with the precision of an artisan. She set up her magic lantern, and once again, the image of Pike and Cutter exchanging money flashed onto a pristine white screen, this time for a federal judge and a jury of 12 men. "Objection," Pike's lawyer said, his voice bored. "This is theater, a magic lantern. It is a fabrication, a trick of light." "It is not a trick, sir," Rowan said, her voice clear and carrying in the high-ceilinged room. "It is chemistry. It is a moment, captured in silver nitrate, a moment that cannot be undone." She was followed by Mrs. Tansy Quill. Mrs. Quill, in her best Sunday dress, placed her telegrapher's logbook on the witness stand as if it were a Bible. She read the entry from October 17th, 1887. She read the routing instructions from Judge Cutter. The federal prosecutor emphasized that tampering with the federal telegraph lines to commit fraud was, in itself, a grievous crime. Then came Mercy Lowell. She did not just bring her mother's letter. She brought the letters from Hemlock and the widow Bryce. She brought the testimony of 3 other families who had been swindled by the county fund and its identical, helpful letters. Pike's lawyer tried to dismiss her. "You are a seamstress. Are you not an expert in land deeds?" "I am an expert in my mother's signature," Mercy replied, her voice ringing with a dignity that silenced the room. "And I am an expert in the fear that has held this valley for 3 years, the fear you put there." Finally, Gideon Vance took the stand. He did not look at Pike or Cutter. He looked at the jury. He told them everything. He told them about Alara's sickness. He told them about the first loan, the desperation, the shame. He held up the original note, the one with the railroad seal. "I was a fool," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I was a coward. I let these men use my grief to buy my silence. I let them hold the Blackwood Bridge fire over my head, a fire I saw their own deputy, Boyd Ledger, flee from. He finally turned, his gaze locking with Pike's. They did not just try to steal my water or my land. They tried to steal my name. They tried to steal my wife's memory. The defense had nothing against the combined, irrefutable proof, the photograph of the crime, the logbook of the conspiracy, and the letters of the pattern. Their arguments collapsed. The verdict was swift, guilty, on all counts. The sentence was a thunderclap. Morrow, Pike, and Ephraim Cutter were sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary at Laramie. Boyd Ledger, who had testified against them in exchange for a lesser charge, received 5. But the judge did not stop there. He issued a federal order of restitution. Every contract, every deed, every loan associated with the fraudulent county fund was declared null and void. The land stolen from Hemlock, from the widow Bryce, from Mercy's family, was to be returned, effective immediately. The railroad was fined a catastrophic amount, with the funds designated to be paid directly to the victims as damages. When the news reached Ash Mesa by wire, the town did not celebrate with shouting. There was a deep, collective sigh, as if the entire valley had been holding its breath for 3 years. 2 days later, the sign outside the town limits, which had once read Ash Mesa, Land of Opportunity, was taken down. A new one was raised, freshly painted by the man who ran the general store. It read, Ash Mesa, Our Deeds Are Clean, before they left Cheyenne. Rowan asked one last thing of her partners. She gathered them on the steps of the courthouse, the afternoon sun low and golden. Mrs. Quill, Mercy, Hemlock, and the widow. Gideon stood beside her. I need one last photograph, she said. Not of the crime, of the result. She set her camera on its tripod. She looked at Gideon. He understood. He stepped forward and placed his large, scarred hand, palm up, on the stone railing. The hand that had dug a grave, that had fought a storm, that had worn the barbed wire scar. Hemlock, his face weathered but his eyes clear for the first time in a year, placed his hand on Gideon's. Then the widow Bryce laid her small, wrinkled hand on his. Then Mrs. Quill, her fingers stained with ink. Then Mercy, her hand steady and strong. Rowan looked through the lens. It was a pillar of hands, a community. She set the timer on her camera, the click, click, click of the mechanism sounding in the quiet afternoon. She ran, her iron ring cold on her finger, and placed her own hand, the one marked with the black stains of her art, on the very top of the pile. The camera's shutter clicked, capturing the image, a testament of hands, built on the foundation of the man who had been the most broken, and now stood as the base for them all. They rode home to Bearflower Lodge not in the teeth of a blizzard, but in the soft, forgiving air of a true spring. The Chinook wind had come, and the great oppressive drifts of snow were finally surrendering. The world was alive with the sound of dripping water, a constant liquid percussion from the eaves of the lodge, from the melting branches of the pines. The snow was pulling back, revealing the first shocking green of new grass. The land was breathing. That night, the new solid roof of the barn was dark against the stars. The lodge was warm, the fire in the stove a steady, comforting presence. The bear rug, which had been a witness to so much, was a pool of soft shadow and warm fur in the firelight. Rowan sat on it, her back against Gideon's legs, reading aloud the final report from the Aspen Sentinel. Gideon was quiet, his hand resting in her hair, his fingers slowly tracing the shell of her ear. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was full. When she finished reading, she let the paper fall. She leaned her head back against his knee. It's over. Gideon, it's really over. He said nothing. He simply moved, shifting beside her, encouraging her to lie back on the rug. He lay beside her, propped on his elbow, just as he had on that first, terrifying night of the second storm. The firelight played across his face, but the shadows in his eyes were gone. He looked at her, at the woman who had brought the light back to his world, and with a tenderness that still made her heart ache. He reached out his hand. He laid it on her, his palm flat against the thin cotton of her shirt, right over her spine. Then, with a slow, agonizingly familiar touch, he drew his finger down the length of her back. Rowan shivered, her eyes closing, a soft gasp escaping her lips. It was the same touch, the same line, but the first time, it had been a question, a discovery in the dark. This time, it was a thank you. It was a statement. You are home, I am home, we are safe. She turned in his arms, her body fitting against his, her hand coming up to cup his jaw, the iron ring a cool, solid weight against his skin. He leaned down. They kissed. It was not the kiss of desperate, lonely relief. It was not the kiss of newfound passion. It was a slow, deep, certain kiss. It was the kiss of two people who had chosen to do the right thing, and had, in doing so, earned the right to love. It was the kiss of partners, of survivors, of a husband and a wife waiting for the haying season. It tasted of smoke and tea, and a future that was as solid as the mountains around them. When they parted, Rowan lay quiet for a moment, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She looked over at the heavy pine box that held her camera, sitting on the table. Slowly, she rose. She went to the table. She closed the lid of the box, the brass clasps clicking shut with a sound of quiet finality. She pushed it gently, not unkindly, to the far end of the table. She turned back to him, a small, soft smile on her face. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "We don't need any pictures. Tomorrow, we just live." Gideon smiled, the smile that now came so easily, and he held out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her back down onto the rug, into the circle of his arms. "And if the morning is cold," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear, "I'll light the fire." The camera's perspective, the story's eye, pulled back. It moved past them, past the bare rug, past the glowing stove. It moved to the small, square window of the lodge. Outside, the painted basin was dark, the mountains vast and silent under the stars, the land breathing in the new spring air, but reflected in the cold glass, shining out into the darkness, was the bright, warm, steady glow of the fire from within, a private sun, a small, perfect circle of light, holding the darkness at bay. The story had begun with a lie written in ink, and it ended with a truth captured in silver. It was the final proof that in the most wild and unforgiving of places, the most patient, the most resilient, and the most powerful weapon was never the gun. It was, and always would be, the light. Thank you for listening. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this story.